In the winter of 1944, an SS Panzer Grenadier officer named Werner Kortenhaus, having barely survived another assault on the Belgian town of Bastogne, sat down and wrote a single sentence in his field journal. It read, "We were not fighting men. We were fighting something that had decided not to die." He was not being poetic. Kortenhaus knew exactly what war was. He had served on the Eastern Front. He had survived the hell of Kursk, where the ground itself seemed to bleed. He had held lines against British soldiers who attacked with a mechanical, almost bureaucratic stubbornness. He believed he had seen everything. And yet, somewhere in the frozen Ardennes, something happened to him that none of those experiences had prepared him for. He encountered the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, and it forever changed what he believed was possible for human beings to endure. This is not a story about heroism the way Hollywood tells it, with slow-motion flags, clean uniforms, and swelling orchestras. This is something quieter and far more disturbing. This is the account of what happened when the most elite ground assault force in the Third Reich, the SS, came into sustained contact with American paratroopers who had no orders to retreat, no obvious way to survive, and no apparent awareness that what they were doing was supposed to be impossible. To understand where this resilience came from, you have to go back to August 1942, when the division was first activated. The Army took ordinary young Americans from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, fishing towns in Maine, and steel mill towns in Pennsylvania. It broke them down to nothing. Then it built them back up into something the world had never quite seen before. Their training was not training in any conventional sense. It was closer to a systematic program of controlled suffering, designed to locate the absolute limit of human endurance and then push men just a bit further. But the physical demands were secondary to the psychological ones. The Army was trying to build a soldier who, when everything went wrong, when the drop was scattered, the radio was dead, the ammunition was running out, and the enemy was everywhere, would look at that situation and decide it was still manageable. General William Lee, the father of American airborne forces, once described the operational philosophy of the unit in these terms: "Give me men who understand that the word 'surrounded' simply means the enemy is now in range in all directions." Back then, it sounded like a joke. In the Ardennes, it became reality. On December 16, 1944, the German High Command, at Hitler's personal insistence, launched a massive counter-offensive. 3 German armies tore through the thinly held Allied lines. The plan depended on speed and shock. The Germans wanted to drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force a negotiated peace. In the first 48 hours it almost worked. The German assault hit with devastating force, and into this chaos, the Allied command made the decision to throw the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The paratroopers had just come off intense combat in the Netherlands. They were exhausted and they lacked everything. They were given about 18 hours to move. The paratroopers climbed into open trucks. The temperatures were already dropping below zero. Many men were riding in summer uniforms, some without helmets, and most without winter gear. They drove through the night toward the sound of a battle that was already going badly. And as they drove, they passed American units streaming back in the opposite direction. Retreating combat veterans shouted warnings, telling the paratroopers, "The Germans have tanks. The SS is coming. It's over." The Screaming Eagles listened to all of this and kept driving toward the guns. By December 21st, the German encirclement was complete. 15,000 Americans were trapped inside the Bastogne perimeter. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees. The forest floor froze hard as concrete, making it nearly impossible to dig foxholes. Wounded men who lay still for more than a few minutes began to die from exposure. Ammunition and medical supplies were dangerously low. Surrounding them were 5 German divisions, heavily supported by armour and artillery. The next day, the German commander, General von Luttwitz, sent officers under a white flag to the American lines carrying a formal ultimatum. It demanded the immediate surrender of Bastogne, warning that continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of the American forces. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the ultimatum, crumpled it up, and said to his staff, "Ah, nuts." When asked what he wanted to put in the official written reply to the German general, McAuliffe decided to use just that. The formal American response read, "To the German commander, nuts," from the American commander. When the German officers asked what the word meant, an American officer told them simply, "It means go to hell." Infuriated, the Germans launched full-scale attacks, using their tanks as battering rams. They expected the frozen paratroopers in their holes to break. They did not break. Major Herbert Bucks, a German operations officer, wrote in his after-action report, "The American parachutists defended every position as though the word retreat had been struck from their vocabulary. We took ground only at costs that made the ground utterly worthless." This is an extraordinary sentence from a professional officer. The Germans had calculated their advance based on what infantry typically does when confronted with overwhelming armour. Typically, infantry gives ground. The men of the 101st were not doing that. SS Unterscharführer Klaus Radaker, who survived an engagement on December 23rd, where his unit lost 2 tanks to just 80 Americans, wrote to his family from a field hospital, "They are not fighting from a foxhole. They are fighting from inside themselves. There is something wrong with them, something that makes them more dangerous than any soldier I have encountered." Behind the grand strategy were individual human beings, like Sergeant Leighton Black, a 22-year-old combat medic. When his aid station, filled with wounded men, came under direct SS assault, Black didn't surrender. Armed with a pistol and a carbine belonging to a wounded soldier, he held the entrance alone for an estimated 40 minutes. When reinforcements arrived, they found 3 dead German soldiers at the threshold and Black still standing, hiding a bayonet wound in his arm. When recommended for the Silver Star, he casually remarked he had been too busy to leave, or Private First Class Vernon Hort, a machine gunner. On Christmas Eve, a German Panzer IV tank rolled out of the dark directly toward his position. A machine gun cannot penetrate tank armour. Every soldier knows this. Hort had 2 choices: abandon his gun or die. He stayed. He fired continuously at the infantry behind the tank, breaking their cohesion and buying time for a bazooka team to reposition and destroy the armour. The tank fired twice in his direction, knocking him back several meters. He got up, found his gun and kept firing. Years later, asked why he didn't retreat, he said, "That was my gun. Those were my guys. What else was I going to do?" This was not one soldier making a dramatic stand. This was an entire division full of men who had each, individually, made that same prior decision. In January 1945, Allied forces captured a tactical assessment written by SS Obersturmführer Otto Dintz of the elite 2nd SS Panzer, Division Das Reich. The document, later analyzed by the US Army War College, focused not on American firepower, but on what Dins called psychological immovability. He wrote, "The American parachute soldier appears to have been conditioned to treat the abandonment of a position as a form of personal failure rather than a tactical option. This creates a defensive cohesion that is nearly impossible to break through conventional assault methods." An SS officer was explicitly telling his superiors we couldn't break them because their psychology was fundamentally different. By Christmas Day, the temperature was -22. Ammunition was nearly gone, and wounded men received only prayers because there were no medical supplies left. The Germans launched a massive, coordinated assault in the pre-dawn hours. Tanks actually pierced the edge of the perimeter. The fighting became room to room, building to building. American soldiers who had been in their holes for 8 days without relief fought through the frozen streets with rifles, grenades, and, in several documented instances, entrenching tools. SS Tank Commander Hans Mangus wrote in his logbook that afternoon, "We gained 300 meters this morning. We lost 47 men taking them. The Americans recaptured the meters by nightfall. I have no words for what these men are." When the war ended, the German testimonials collected regarding the 101st were larger and more emphatic than for any other Allied formation. SS Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Holzer, a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, admitted, "In 12 months of combat in Russia, I never encountered troops who made me question whether we could win. After Bastogne, I questioned it every day." A phrase even spread among German soldiers, Amerikanisch Verteidigt, defended like an American. Initially used on the Eastern Front to mock an enemy holding a position past the point of rational military logic, artillery officer Hans Vogelsang later wrote, "By the time I came home from the Ardennes, I was no longer certain it was a condescension. It was the highest professional praise we knew how to offer." General von Lüttwitz, the man who had demanded their surrender, summarized it perfectly in his post-war memoirs. "I have been asked many times why we did not take Bastogne. The honest answer is that we did not take it because the men defending it had decided that they would not allow it to be taken. And I had no operational response to that decision." It is the most devastating sentence a military commander can write. It means, I brought everything the doctrine said should work, but it failed because my opponent chose an option that the doctrine does not account for. The 101st Airborne Division emerged from the Ardennes campaign having suffered nearly 19,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. What they had gone through was not just a battle. It was an extended experiment in the absolute edge of human endurance. And that edge turned out to be much further out than anyone, including the Germans, had believed. The SS had marched on Bastogne believing they were fighting a second-rate army, pampered boys who would fold when the cold came and the ammunition ran out. Instead, they found 15,000 young Americans who had decided, collectively and individually, that this was where they were going to stand. This was the place. These were the people they were going to fight beside, and whatever came at them from the dark was going to have to deal with that decision. The Germans called it psychological immovability. We call it character.